The pulse of American industry did not begin with a marketing slogan, but with the cold, rhythmic ticking of a locomotive engine. Walter Percy Chrysler was a man of tolerances and steel, a machinist who understood that a company was only as strong as its smallest gear. When he reorganized the Maxwell Motor Company on June 6, 1925, he wasn't just launching a brand, he was weaponizing the concept of the engineering company. His triumvirate of engineers, Zetter, Skelton, and Breer, brought a railroad-grade precision to the streets, introducing high-compression engines and the first mass-produced four-wheel hydraulic brakes. These weren't just features, they were declarations of war against the mechanical complacency of the era. From the 1924 Chrysler 6 to the crowning Art Deco peak of the Chrysler Building, the company was a testament to the belief that the American worker could outthink, outbuild, and outpace any rival on the globe. But the pursuit of perfection can often lead to a dangerous isolation from the very market it serves. In 1934, Chrysler looked into the wind and saw the future, but the future was a lonely place. The Chrysler Airflow was a vision of aerodynamic purity developed in the industry's first wind tunnel alongside Orville Wright. It moved the engine forward, moved the passengers into a unibody steel cage, and promised a floating ride that felt like gliding on glass. Yet, in the suffocating gloom of the Great Depression, the public recoiled from its radical, streamlined form, dismissing it as an anonymous lump. The manufacturing complexity of its all-steel frame led to catastrophic delays and early defects, proving that in the brutal theater of industrial capitalism, being right too early is no different from being wrong. The Airflow was a mechanical triumph that nearly bankrupted the spirit of the firm, instilling a conservative fear that would haunt Chrysler's design studios for a generation. The silence was finally shattered by the roar of the HEMI. In 1951, the firepower V8 engine transformed the American driveway into a laboratory for high-performance thermodynamics. This was the era of the forward look, where Virgil Exner's pen turned the boxy remnants of the 1940s into low-slung, aggressive predators with tail fins that clawed at the clouds. Inspired by the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, these cars looked like they were in motion even when parked in a suburban cul-de-sac. The colors were as loud as the engines, plum crazy, HEMI orange, and sassy grass, defiant hues that screamed for attention in an era of gray flannel suits and corporate conformity. For a brief moment, Chrysler was the vanguard of American cool, a brand that understood that speed was the ultimate currency of the post-war dream. But beneath the chrome and the fins, the engineering company was losing its grip on the quality that had once been its foundation. By the late 1970s, the dream had become a nightmare of red ink and empty lots. Chrysler was bleeding $1 billion a year, its lots filled with unsold, fuel-hungry giants that the world no longer wanted. Enter Lee Iacocca, the quintessential American salesman, with a $1 a year salary and a desperate plan to save a dying titan. He didn't just ask for a bailout, he commanded a national conversation about the survival of the industrial heartland. The 1980 Loan Guarantee Act was a high-stakes gamble that forced the United States government to co-sign for the company's survival. The savior was the K car, A simple front-wheel drive box that was anything but glamorous, but it was exactly what a desperate market needed. Iacocca then leveraged that platform to create the minivan, a vehicle that redefined the family car and pumped billions back into the company, allowing Chrysler to pay back its government debt 7 years ahead of schedule. The resurgence of the 1980s gave way to the hubris of the 1990s. As the cab-forward design of the LH platform made Chrysler the darling of Wall Street once again, the unthinkable happened. A merger of equals with Germany's Daimler-Benz in 1998. The Chrysler Pentastar was supposed to fuse with the Mercedes Star to create a global hegemon. But the marriage made in heaven quickly descended into a cultural war zone. The rigid, hierarchical world of Stuttgart had no room for the nimble, rebellious spirit of Detroit. The American executives were purged, and the merger was exposed as a slow-motion takeover that drained Chrysler of its best talent and resources. By the time Cerberus Capital Management bought the company for a fraction of its value in 2007, Chrysler was a hollowed-out shell, a legacy brand being flipped like a distressed asset by private equity kings who knew everything about spreadsheets and nothing about the soul of a car. The final unraveling came in the cold spring of 2009. As the global financial system melted down, Chrysler's sales collapsed by nearly 30%. The company that had survived the Depression and the energy crisis finally ran out of road. Chapter 11 was no longer a threat, it was a reality. In a lightning-fast reorganization, the federal government used billions in taxpayer money to buy the company's freedom, eventually handing the keys to the Italians at Fiat. The human cost was staggering. In Highland Park, the former headquarters became a ghost town of shattered glass and weed-choked parking lots. A city that had once boomed with 50,000 residents, now left to decay. The Lynch Road plant fell silent. The arsenal of democracy had been decommissioned. Today, the Chrysler name survives, but as a shadow of the engineering powerhouse that Walter P. once envisioned. A cautionary tale of how easily an industrial empire can be dismantled when the ledger takes precedence over the machine. The decline of Chrysler is mirrored in the landscape of Detroit's East Side, where the hulking remains of the Jefferson Avenue plant once stood as a testament to Albert Kahn's architectural genius. For 82 years, this factory built everything from DeSoto's to the tanks that liberated Europe. When it closed its doors in 1990, it took with it the lifeblood of a neighborhood, leaving behind only the Spirit of Detroit monument to watch over a city of shrinking horizons. The social contract that once guaranteed a middle-class life in exchange for a shift on the assembly line was torn up, replaced by the unimaginable times of Bob Nardelli's cost-cutting crusades. Thousands of families were furloughed, their pensions placed in jeopardy as the company was split into Old Chrysler and New Chrysler in a New York courtroom. The heritage of the brand was sacrificed to satisfy a mathematical equation, a clinical extraction of value that left the workers to count the pennies on the dollar that remained. The ghost of Highland Park still haunts the intersection of Woodward and Manchester, where the once bustling engineering buildings now sit vacant and rotting. This wasn't just an office. It was the brain of an empire, the place where the airflow was conceived and the HEMI was perfected. When Chrysler moved its headquarters to Auburn Hills in 1992, it paid the city $44 million in compensation, But you cannot compensate for the loss of a city's soul. The departure was catastrophic, triggering the closure of the hospital and the Sears store, leaving the majority black population to navigate the wreckage of a corporate hollowing out. It is a story as old as time. The company moves to the suburbs, and the city that built it is left to burn. The hollowing of Highland Park is the silent tragedy of Chrysler, a literal erasure of the manufacturing landscape that once put the world on wheels. The engineering of the 2005 Chrysler 300 offered a brief, shining moment of hope, a car that melded German engineering with American aesthetics. Utilizing the rear suspension and transmission of the Mercedes E-Class, the 300 was a styling hit that brought back the old-school rear-wheel drive muscle car scene. But even this success was bittersweet, a reminder that the engineering company now had to borrow its DNA from overseas to remain relevant. The car's chassis felt solid, its V8 HEMI was powerful, and for a few years it seemed like Chrysler might reclaim its throne. But the success of the 300 could not hide the structural rot of the Daimler relationship. The marriage made in heaven had become a prison of misaligned goals and ethnocentric management, proving that you cannot build a future on a foundation of mutual distrust and conflicting corporate cultures. When Cerberus Capital Management took over in 2007, they promised a long-term commitment to Chrysler's growth, but their actions told a different story. Under Bob Nardelli, the focus was on the divestment of non-earning assets and the termination of over 700 dealerships. They attempted to hide a $35 million offer for the Viper line during the bankruptcy proceedings, a move that drew the ire of congressional investigators who questioned if the company was being managed in the best interest of the American taxpayer. The Cerberus era was a clinical exercise in private equity liquidation, a period where the company was tore to shreds until it was so helpless that General Motors wouldn't even consider a merger. It was the ultimate betrayal of Walter Chrysler's vision, an industrial icon being treated like a distressed real estate portfolio, stripped of its dignity before being handed over to fiat for free. The 2009 bankruptcy was a surgical strike against the traditional laws of corporate priority. In 42 days, the old Chrysler was discarded like a used filter, while the new Chrysler emerged with a clean slate and a new set of masters. The secured bondholders, including retired Indiana policemen, were forced to accept 29 cents on the dollar, while the United Auto Workers were given a majority stake in the new entity. It was a reversal of bankruptcy norms that sent shockwaves through the capital markets, a signal that in the new reality of too big to fail, political power was more valuable than a senior lien. The government-led restructuring rescued the company, but it did so by upending the very legal foundations upon which the American industrial system was built. It was a rescue that looked like a heist to those on the losing side of the ledger. The human cost of these maneuvers is tallied in the thousands of lost jobs and the devastating consequences for the 870,000 UAW retirees whose health and pension plans were left hanging by a thread. While the federal bailouts are often hailed as a success because the companies lived to fight another day, the economic wreckage remains scattered across the Midwest. The loss of taxpayer money, estimated at over $1 billion for Chrysler alone, is a secondary concern compared to the destabilization of working-class communities that had spent generations building the brand. The arsenal of democracy is now a landscape of dead zones and foreclosed homes, a city where half the black population lives in poverty while the corporate headquarters sits behind the glass walls of a suburban tech center. This is the fallout of the industrial decline, a social cost that is never fully accounted for in the quarterly reports. To look at the Chrysler logo today, the sleek silver wings of the 2009 redesign, is to see a brand that has spent a century searching for an identity. From the golden wax seal of 1924 to the iconic blue Pentastar of the 1960s, the company's visual identity has been as volatile as its balance sheet. Each redesign was attempted to signal a new beginning, a seal of approval for a company that was constantly reinventing itself to survive. But the wings of Mercury, representing speed and progress, now seem like a cruel irony for a company that has been anchored by debt and dysfunction for so long. The metallic silver mimics the chrome of the cars, but it cannot hide the rust of the history beneath. The brand remains a combination mark of ambition and failure, a sophisticated logo for an empire that has been sold and resold until its origins are a distant memory. The story of Chrysler is the story of the 20th century American experiment. A brilliant, messy, and ultimately fragile dream that was built on the assembly line and dismantled in the boardroom. It is the story of the machinist from Kansas who built an empire and the private equity kings from New York who liquidated it. It is the story of the Airflow's aerodynamic dreams and the HEMI's high-octane reality. But most of all, it is a story of the people of Detroit and Highland Park, the men and women who gave their lives to the engineering company, only to see their world collapse in a cloud of bankruptcy filings and unimaginable times. The legacy of Chrysler is not just in the cars it built, but in the lessons it left behind about the cost of hubris and the price of survival in a globalized world. The ruins of Lynch Road are a silent monument to the era of the B platform, the place where the Dodge Charger and the Plymouth Belvedere were born. Now it is a site for warehouse operations, a desaturated landscape of weathered concrete and rusted structural steel. This is where the muscle car was king, where the high-impact colors of 1970 once brightened the industrial gloom. To walk these floors today is to feel the weight of 1,000 vanished shifts, the echo of an era when Detroit was the undisputed capital of the automotive world. The plucked chickens of the 1962 downsizing were built here, a reminder that even in its prime, the company was capable of catastrophic errors. The history of Lynch Road is the history of Chrysler in miniature, a cycle of boom and bust that has left the land scarred and the people weary. The engineering of the future now belongs to Stellantis, a global entity that must manage the legacy of Chrysler alongside brands from across the Atlantic. The new HEMI still roars in the Challenger, but the era of the high-displacement V8 is drawing to a close, replaced by the clinical efficiency of electric platforms and active combustion chambers. The transition from smokestack to high-tech capitalism that Iacocca once championed has reached its final phase, and the engineering company must once again find a way to reinvent itself or face final obsolescence. The warrants have been sold, the loans have been repaid, and the factories have been demolished. All that remains is the name, a legacy brand that serves as a container for our collective nostalgia for a time when America's power was measured in horsepower and torque. Walter Chrysler's autobiography was titled Life of an American Workman, a testament to his belief in the dignity of labor and the power of the machine. But the modern Chrysler is a product of the financial system meltdown, a company that has been turned to shreds by the very forces of capital that Walter once mastered. The distorted priorities of the bankruptcy process have left a bitter taste in the mouths of many, a sense that the social construction of corporate reality has been manipulated to benefit the few at the expense of the many. The trauma of the firm's near collapse has become a permanent feature of its identity, a scar that defines the brand more than any aerodynamic profile or engine configuration ever could. The American workman has been replaced by the global analyst, and the machine has been replaced by the platform. The Chrysler Building still stands in Manhattan, its Nerosta steel spire a paragon of Art Deco style that refuses to tarnish. It is a reminder of what the company once was, a symbol of an ambition that reached for the stars and a precision that was unmatched. But the building is now a quintessential landmark for tourists, a piece of architectural history that has been disconnected from the automotive firm that gave it its name. The gargoyles still look out over the city, but the factory fires they once represented have gone cold. The visual signature of the hubcaps and fenders remains etched in the stone, a permanent record of an industrial age that has passed into the realm of myth. The building is the only part of the Chrysler legacy that cannot be liquidated, a Maltese cross of steel that stands as a silent witness to the decline of the empire. To understand the cost of the Chrysler decline, one must look at the mapping of poverty in Detroit's urban core, where the declining tax base has eroded the city's ability to supply even the most basic services. The dead zones of abandoned neighborhoods are the direct result of the factory closings that were accelerated by the bankruptcy and the move to Auburn Hills. The human suffering of the retirees and the crippling losses of the dealers are the true balance sheet of the company's history, a ledger of social debt that will never be repaid. The spirit of Detroit is a monument of bronze, but the spirit of the people is one of survival in a world that has liquidated their past. The story of Chrysler is a cautionary tale for any nation that believes its industrial might is eternal, a reminder that even the strongest steel can be shattered by a failure of vision. The final directive of the engineering company was to design with purpose, to build revolutionary vehicles that were both affordable and innovative. As we look toward the horizon of the 21st century, that purpose seems more relevant than ever, yet more difficult to achieve. The legacy of Walter P. Chrysler is not just in the cars, but in the spirit of the American workman who believed that a better world could be built with a wrench and a blueprint. Whether that spirit can survive the unimaginable times of the future is the final question of the Chrysler story. For now, the wings of the logo remain spread, a gesture of speed and freedom in a world that is increasingly defined by boundaries and balance sheets. The engine may be silent, but the narrative of Chrysler continues to echo through the halls of history, a long, resonant down note at the end of an American industrial symphony.